Darkness clung to the early morning air, thick and unforgiving, as Jamal pulled the front door shut behind him. He winced at the creak of the rusted hinges, holding his breath until he was certain no one had stirred inside. The last thing he needed was for Rodney Holloway to wake up and find him sneaking out again. The bruises from last time had only just started to fade. Jamal tugged his worn hoodie tighter around his small frame, trying to block out the bitter cold. His sneakers, full of holes and barely holding together with frayed laces, scraped against the cracked pavement as he stepped off the porch. His backpack, lighter than it should be, slumped against his spine, carrying nothing but a single notebook, a dull pencil, and an empty plastic lunchbox he knew would stay empty today. His stomach rumbled, a sharp reminder of the dinner he hadn't eaten last night. Not that there had been much to eat anyway. Rodney and his girlfriend, Lisa, always made sure to have full plates, but when it came to Jamal, they suddenly became experts in rationing. "You eat at school, don't you?" Rodney had sneered last night, smirking as he scraped the last bits of mashed potatoes from Jamal's plate onto his own. Be grateful for that. Jamal knew better than to argue. He knew better than to complain. Complaining got him nowhere, except maybe another bruise, another long night locked in his tiny room, another reminder that he was nothing more than a paycheck to the Holloways. So he kept quiet. He swallowed his hunger, pushed down his exhaustion, and kept moving. The streets were silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves skittering across the pavement. A few houses still had porch lights on, casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalk. The air smelled of damp earth and the distant scent of someone's early morning coffee. Jamal had walked this same path every single day for the past 2 years, through rain, through scorching heat, and now through the creeping fingers of winter. 20 miles. 2 hours each way. It was just part of his life now. His legs ached with every step, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to be late again. The last time he'd been late, Rodney had made sure he learned his lesson. Jamal had spent an entire night locked outside on the back porch in nothing but his pajamas. The cold had seeped into his bones so deep he swore he still felt the chill sometimes. So he walked. By the time he reached the industrial district, the first hints of sunlight were beginning to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of deep blue and purple. This was the part of the journey he hated the most. Here the sidewalks disappeared, and he had to walk along the highway's shoulder, hugging the edge of the road as cars zoomed past, their headlights briefly illuminating his small figure before vanishing into the distance. A massive truck rumbled by, its horn blasting so suddenly that Jamal flinched, stumbling sideways onto the loose gravel. He barely caught himself before his knees hit the ground. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a shaky breath and forced himself to keep moving. No one stopped. No one ever stopped. A police car crept past him, its red and blue lights reflecting off the guardrail. Jamal tensed, instinctively lowering his head, hoping the officer wouldn't take an interest in him. He had learned long ago that attention from cops rarely meant anything good. But the car didn't speed off like usual. Instead, it slowed. Jamal kept his eyes locked on the pavement, his steps quick and deliberate, pretending he didn't notice. The car trailed behind him for a few moments before finally pulling ahead and disappearing around the bend. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe the cop had just been patrolling. Maybe it had nothing to do with him. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. By the time he reached the school, the sun had fully risen, casting long golden beams across the pavement. His legs felt like lead, his breath came in short, sharp bursts, and sweat had soaked through his hoodie, despite the morning chill. But at least he had made it. The school building loomed ahead, tall and familiar, a strange kind of sanctuary in his chaotic world. Here, at least he wasn't just a foster kid. Here, he wasn't just an inconvenience. Here, he could be invisible if he wanted to be. He slipped through the front doors just as the first bell rang. the warmth of the school heating system wrapping around him like a blanket. Students bustled through the halls, laughing, talking, shoving past each other, completely unaware of the battle he fought just to stand among them. As he made his way to his locker, a voice called his name. Jamal. He turned to see Mrs. Carter, his homeroom teacher, watching him with quiet concern. She was one of the few teachers who actually seemed to notice things. The kind who asked questions. The kind who cared. Her gaze flickered over his disheveled appearance, the tear in his jeans, the exhaustion carved into his face, the bruises barely hidden beneath the sleeves of his hoodie. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Jamal forced a smile, one he had practiced 100 times in the mirror. "Yeah," he said, "I'm good." He wasn't, but saying otherwise wouldn't change anything. Officer Daniel Grayson sipped his lukewarm coffee, eyes fixed on the near-empty road ahead. The early morning shift was usually slow, just the occasional speeding driver or a call about some stray dog causing a nuisance. It gave him too much time to think. And lately, thinking was the last thing he wanted to do. He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. His wife had left 2 months ago, taking their daughter with her. The house was too quiet now, too empty. Work was the only thing keeping him sane. That's when he saw the boy again. A small, thin figure trudging along the side of the highway, his hoodie pulled up against the cold. Same time, same place, same exhausted determination in his step. Grayson had noticed him a few times before, but had never given it much thought. Kids walked all the time. Maybe he missed the bus. Maybe he was just getting some air. But something about this boy made him hesitate. Why was he always alone? Why was he walking here, miles away from the nearest neighborhood? Grayson slowed his patrol car, watching as the boy kept his head down, his steps careful and deliberate. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He had a destination, a purpose. Curiosity gnawed at Grayson. He had spent 2 decades on the force, enough time to develop a gut instinct for when something wasn't right. And right now, every nerve in his body was telling him that this wasn't right. Flipping on his turn signal, he eased onto the shoulder, keeping a safe distance. The boy's steps faltered for the briefest moment before he continued on as if he hadn't noticed. But Grayson knew better. He wasn't going to spook him. Not yet. Instead, he decided to follow. For the next few miles, he stayed behind at a distance, watching as the boy carefully navigated the uneven gravel. Occasionally, a truck or car would speed past, sending gusts of cold wind whipping against his thin frame. But he never slowed, never stopped. This wasn't just a walk. This was something else. After nearly an hour, the outskirts of the town came into view, and the boy's posture shifted ever so slightly, like someone nearing the end of a grueling marathon. The school building stood in the distance, students beginning to filter inside. Grayson pulled into the parking lot and watched as the boy climbed the front steps, disappearing into the crowd. He sat there for a long moment, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. His gut told him that whatever was happening with that kid, it wasn't something he could just ignore. The next morning, he was back. Same time, same place, same boy. This time, Grayson didn't just follow. This time, he rolled down his window. "Hey, kid." The boy tensed but didn't stop. Grayson kept his tone casual. "You need a ride?" "No, sir," the boy said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm fine." Grayson nodded, even though he knew that wasn't true. "Long walk to school," he commented. The boy said nothing, just kept walking. "How far is it?" The hesitation was brief. 20 miles. Grayson blinked. "You walked 20 miles to school." Still, the boy didn't slow down. Grayson exhaled, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "You got a name?" A pause. Then, finally, "Jamal." Grayson nodded. "I'm Officer Grayson." Jamal didn't respond. The cop didn't push. Instead, he just watched as the boy walked the entire way again, never once asking for help. That night, Grayson pulled up Jamal's school records. What he found made his stomach turn. Multiple reports of neglect, a foster home known for complaints, absences, late arrivals. No one had done anything. No one had stepped in. No one had cared. Grayson leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. Well, someone cared now, and he wasn't about to let this go. Jamal's legs ached as he finally reached the school's front steps, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The journey had drained him, but at least he had made it, just like he always did. The warmth of the school building wrapped around him the moment he stepped inside, but it did little to ease the exhaustion clinging to his body. He kept his head down, weaving through the crowded hallways, hoping no one would notice the tear in his jeans or the way his shoes barely held together. He just needed to get to class. If he could make it through the day, he'd have a few hours of peace before he had to walk the 20 miles home again. Jamal. The voice stopped him in his tracks. He turned slowly, already knowing who it was. Mrs. Carter stood in front of him, her gaze sweeping over him with quiet concern. She had been his homeroom teacher for almost a year now, and unlike most of the other teachers, she actually seemed to notice things. She noticed when he skipped lunch. She noticed when he wore the same clothes for weeks. She noticed when he showed up with bruises he couldn't explain. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Jamal forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm good." It was the same answer he always gave. But this time, Mrs. Carter didn't just nod and let him go. "Come with me for a second," she said instead, her voice gentle but firm. Jamal hesitated, but refusing would only make things worse. Reluctantly, he followed her into an empty classroom. She pulled out a chair, gesturing for him to sit. He obeyed, shifting uncomfortably as she crouched down so they were at eye level. "You're not okay, are you?" Jamal swallowed, staring at his hands. If he told the truth, what would happen? He had been in the foster system long enough to know that speaking up rarely changed anything. The last time he had told a teacher that something was wrong, the caseworker had come, talked to Rodney and Lisa, and left with a smile, assuring him that everything was fine. Nothing had changed. If anything, it had only gotten worse. So what was the point? "I'm fine," he repeated. Mrs. Carter studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Okay," she said, standing up. "But if you ever need anything, I'm here. And so is the school counselor. You don't have to go through this alone, Jamal." He nodded, but he knew better. He had always been alone. By the time the final bell rang, dread had settled in his stomach. The walk home was always worse. The exhaustion from the day weighed on him, making his legs feel like they were made of lead. The cold was sharper, the streets darker. And tonight, there was something else. A police car, parked just down the street, waiting. Jamal's heart pounded. He didn't run, but he wanted to. Instead, he forced himself to walk as normally as possible, hoping, praying, that the cop wasn't there for him. But as he passed, the window rolled down. "Hey, Jamal." He froze. Officer Grayson leaned against the window frame, his expression unreadable. "Need a ride?" Jamal shook his head immediately. "No, sir." Grayson sighed. "Look, I know you walked 20 miles to get home. I know what's going on. Let me help." Jamal took a step back. "I don't need help." Grayson studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but I'm gonna be here tomorrow." Jamal didn't respond. He just turned and started walking. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was still alone. Jamal kept his pace steady, forcing himself not to look back as he put distance between himself and the police car. The cold bit at his fingers, his hoodie doing little to keep the wind from seeping into his bones. His legs already felt like lead, but he couldn't stop. He had no choice. Stopping meant freezing. Stopping meant being late. Stopping meant Rodney might be waiting for him, belt in hand, demanding to know why he was late again. He shuddered at the thought, quickening his steps despite the dull ache creeping into his muscles. The road stretched endlessly before him, the sky darkening with every mile. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A truck sped past, the force of the wind nearly knocking him off balance. He stumbled but caught himself just in time. He wasn't sure how much longer he could do this. But he had to. He'd done it every day for months. He could do it again. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. What he hadn't counted on was the police car trailing him again. It wasn't close, just far enough to let him know that Officer Grayson hadn't left. Jamal's stomach tightened. Why was this cop still here? Why did he care? Adults never cared. Not really. His fists clenched as he walked faster, but the car didn't move. It just sat there, idling, its headlights illuminating the empty street. He tried to ignore it, block it out. But as he turned the corner into the industrial part of town, the headlights flicked off, and the car started moving. Jamal's heart pounded. He had been followed before, but not by a cop, not by someone who claimed they wanted to help. He bit his lip, forcing himself to stay calm. If he ran, it would look suspicious. He just had to keep walking. Eventually, the cop would give up, wouldn't he? But then, a sharp bark of a siren cut through the night, short and controlled. Not enough to be an alarm, just enough to make Jamal stop in his tracks. His breath caught. Footsteps, crunching against the gravel. Jamal turned slowly. Officer Grayson had stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. His hands were tucked into his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "I know you don't trust me." Jamal's fists tightened. "I wouldn't trust me either," Grayson admitted, his voice even. "You've been let down too many times." Jamal looked away, his jaw clenched. "I don't blame you," the cop continued, "but I need you to know something." Jamal waited. "You shouldn't have to do this," Grayson said, his tone quieter now. "No kid should have to walk 20 miles just to get an education." Jamal swallowed hard, his throat burning. "It's not your fault." Something cracked in Jamal's chest. It was just a few words, just a simple statement, but it was something no one had ever told him before. Not his caseworkers. Not his teachers. Not Rodney. He forced himself to keep his expression blank. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. Not ever. "I don't need your help," he muttered, turning away. "Maybe not," Grayson admitted, "but I'm gonna help anyway." Jamal stiffened. "You can't. You'd be surprised what I can do." Jamal shook his head. "They won't believe you." Grayson tilted his head. "Who won't?" Jamal hesitated. He had already said too much. With a sharp breath, he turned back toward the road and kept walking. Grayson didn't stop him this time. But as Jamal disappeared into the darkness, he knew one thing for certain. The cop wasn't going to let this go. Jamal's feet dragged against the pavement as he neared the rundown house he was forced to call home. The porch light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the warped wooden steps leading up to the front door. His stomach clenched at the sight of the old pickup truck parked in the driveway. Rodney was home. That meant trouble. He hesitated, his fingers curling around the straps of his backpack. If he could just get inside without making any noise, maybe he could make it to his room before. The front door swung open before he even touched the handle. Rodney stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, his massive frame filling the entrance. His expression was unreadable, but Jamal didn't need to see his face to know what was coming. "You're late." Jamal swallowed hard, lowering his gaze. "I walked as fast as I could." Rodney let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against his bicep. "You walked fast, huh?" He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You always got excuses, don't you, boy?" Jamal said nothing. Rodney stepped forward, forcing Jamal back a step. "Got a little fan club now, huh?" he muttered. "Little Bird told me a cop was sniffing around." Jamal's blood ran cold. How did he know? His silence only seemed to amuse Rodney. "What, you think I wouldn't hear about it? You think people ain't watching?" He leaned in closer, the smell of stale beer thick on his breath. "That cop ain't your friend, boy. You say one wrong thing, you know what happens." Jamal's hands curled into fists. He knew exactly what happened. He had the scars to prove it. "I didn't tell him nothing," he said quietly. Rodney studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." Jamal flinched as Rodney reached for him, but instead of hitting him, the man grabbed the front of his hoodie, gripping the fabric tightly. "Because you ain't got nowhere else to go, boy. You understand that?" Jamal's breath came in short, sharp bursts. Rodney gave him a small shake before shoving him back. "Now get inside. And don't let me hear another word about no cop." Jamal didn't wait. He slipped past Rodney and into the house, the familiar scent of cigarette smoke and cheap liquor burning his nose. He kept his head down, moving quickly toward his room at the end of the hall. The door barely shut behind him before his knees gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, his back against the door. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't tell anyone. No one ever believed kids like him. And even if they did, what then? They'd just stick him in another home with another Rodney. That was how the system worked. He was trapped. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against them to keep the tears from falling. He wouldn't cry. He wouldn't break. But deep down, something had shifted. Grayson wasn't going away. And Rodney knew it. The next morning, Jamal was out the door before the sun had even started to rise. His body ached, his stomach empty, but he didn't slow down. He just needed to get to school. That was the goal. That was the only thing that mattered. But as he reached the edge of town, the familiar black and white police car was already there, waiting. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest as he kept his eyes on the ground, pretending not to see it. Maybe if he ignored it, Grayson would leave him alone. Maybe he'd give up. The car door opened. Jamal. He kept walking. Footsteps. Grayson wasn't staying in the car this time. Jamal clenched his jaw as the cop caught up to him, his voice calm but firm. "I know what's going on." Jamal stopped in his tracks. His hands trembled at his sides, but he didn't turn around. "You don't have to say anything," Grayson continued, his voice softer now. "But I need you to know that I'm not just going to walk away." Jamal let out a shaky breath. He wanted to believe him. He really did. But believing meant hoping, and hope always led to disappointment. So instead, he took a deep breath and kept walking. Grayson didn't stop him. But Jamal knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. Jamal's steps felt heavier than usual as he walked. Not just because of exhaustion, though that was there, gnawing at his muscles and weighing on his bones. Not just because of hunger, though that too clawed at his stomach like an old familiar pain. It was something else this time. A feeling he couldn't shake. A feeling that something was about to change. Officer Grayson had followed him every day that week, keeping his distance, but never leaving him alone. He never asked more questions, never pressured him. He just stayed. That was new. Jamal didn't know what to do with it. But Rodney did. The night before, after he'd come home from school, Rodney had been waiting for him. There was no yelling, no accusations this time. Just an eerie silence as he leaned against the kitchen counter, flipping a cigarette between his fingers. "You think that cop's your friend, don't you?" Rodney had muttered, his voice low, dangerous. Jamal had kept his head down. He didn't answer, didn't need to. Rodney had laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "I told you, boy. They don't care about you. They only care about what trouble you can bring them." Jamal had clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream at him, tell him he was wrong. But was he? Jamal had barely slept that night, replaying every interaction with Grayson in his head. Was the cop just going to get bored and move on? Would he decide Jamal wasn't worth the trouble, like every other adult had. He didn't know. But today, something felt different. As he walked toward the familiar highway stretch, Grayson's police car was already parked at the edge of the road. But this time, he wasn't sitting inside. He was standing next to it, arms crossed, waiting. Jamal's heart pounded as he slowed to a stop. Grayson met his eyes. "Get in." Jamal's breath caught. "What?" Grayson nodded toward the car. "I'm taking you to school." Jamal stared at him. It was a trap. It had to be. Nothing came for free. Rodney's words echoed in his head. "They don't care about you." But then Grayson sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "Look, I know you don't trust me. You have every reason not to. But I can't watch you do this anymore." He gestured toward the road. "This isn't okay, Jamal. This isn't normal. And I'm not going to just sit back and pretend it is." Jamal hesitated. No one had ever said that before. No one had ever looked at him and actually seen what was happening. Grayson sighed again. "I'm not just offering you a ride to school, kid. I'm offering you a way out." Jamal felt his throat tighten. "There is no way out," he muttered. Rodney doesn't own you." Jamal's head snapped up, his breath catching. Grayson took a step forward, his voice steady but fierce. "You hear me? You are not his property. And he doesn't get to decide how your story ends." Jamal's vision blurred for a second. He blinked hard. Hope was dangerous. Hope could get him hurt. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to believe. He took a shaky breath. And he opened the car door. The ride was quiet at first. Jamal kept his hands clenched in his lap, his shoulders tense. Every few minutes, he glanced at the door handle, just in case he needed to run. Grayson didn't say anything. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. But then, as they neared the school, Grayson finally spoke. "I know about the money." Jamal froze. "What?" Grayson's grip on the wheel tightened. "The state sends money for you. For food, clothes, school supplies. Rodney's been taking it, hasn't he?" Jamal's pulse pounded. He couldn't answer. He didn't have to. Grayson sighed. "That's what I thought." Jamal turned toward him, panic rising. "You can't tell anyone," he blurted. "You don't understand." "Jamal." Grayson's voice was firm. "I'm a cop. It's my job to understand." Jamal's chest heaved. This was it. The moment it all went wrong. "Rodney will kill me," he whispered. Grayson pulled the car into the school parking lot and shifted it into park. Then he turned to face Jamal fully, his expression unreadable. "You're not going back there," he said. Jamal's heart slammed against his ribs. "What?" Grayson nodded toward the school doors. "Go to class. Do what you need to do, but when school's over, I'm picking you up, and we're going to make sure you never have to step foot in that house again." Jamal's breath caught. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But Grayson wasn't joking. Jamal felt his hands tremble as he reached for the door handle. "Okay," he whispered. And for the first time in years, he stepped into school with something that almost felt like hope.